In late August 1944, at Wehrmacht headquarters, Colonel General Alfred Jodl looked at the maps of the collapsing Western Front. The numbers seemed clear. General Patton's Third Army had raced nearly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, far ahead of its supplies. Jodl and his staff were convinced the American advance would grind to a halt within days, maybe hours. After all, an armored division could burn through 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day. The arithmetic was merciless. Patton would stall, giving the Wehrmacht precious time to regroup. What Jodl couldn't see from his map table was a sight that would have defied his military logic. Nearly 6,000 trucks were already thundering east in a constant stream, headlights blazing in open defiance of blackout rules. This was the Red Ball Express, a logistics effort so bold that German military planners had never even imagined it. It was about to shatter every German assumption about what mechanized warfare could sustain. The most respected minds in the German officer corps were about to learn a painful lesson about American logistics delivered by 23,000 truck drivers, 3/4 of whom were African American, who turned a one-way road network into the most efficient military supply chain the world had ever seen. The German confidence came from long experience. They had invented blitzkrieg and understood the iron rule of supply. Their own campaigns, especially in the vastness of the Soviet Union, had often faltered not because of enemy resistance, but because fuel and ammunition couldn't keep up. German trucks broke down on rough Russian roads, and the horse-drawn wagons that still made up most of their transport could never match the speed of their tanks. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, a panzer commander, wrote in July that the Americans were now facing the same insoluble problem. Mechanization, he argued, had become a liability. German intelligence meticulously tracked American consumption. A single Sherman tank got about half a mile to the gallon on roads. An infantry division needed 700 tons of supplies a day. An armored division, 1,000. Patton had 12 divisions pushing forward. The math seemed simple. 12 divisions needed around 12,000 tons of supplies daily, moved 400 miles along bombed-out roads. Major General Siegfried Westphal, another high-ranking German officer, wrote on August 20th that even if the Americans had unlimited trucks and flawless roads, which they didn't, they still couldn't keep Patton moving for more than 2 more days. Physical limits, he insisted, could not be ignored, not even by a mighty industrial power like the United States. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On the afternoon of August 25th, in a French chateau near Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers addressed a group of doubtful American officers. The situation was dire. Patton was consuming supplies faster than any army in history, moving at speeds no one had planned for. Traditional supply systems had collapsed. Ayers laid out a radical plan. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are going to turn the roads from Cherbourg to the front into a one-way highway. Every truck will run 20 hours out of 24. We will move at least 12,500 tons per day." The operation as named came from railroad jargon. A Red Ball freight train was an express shipment with absolute priority. The Red Ball Express would follow the same logic. Everything would yield to it. No delays, no exceptions. The plan's details defied every military textbook. 2 parallel, one-way road systems. One for loaded trucks going to the front, one for empty trucks returning. Round-the-clock operations with headlights on, abandoning all blackout procedures. A strict no-stop rule except for fuel and emergencies. Convoys would leave every 5 minutes, maintaining an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Mobile repair units were stationed every 50 miles. Military police checkpoints would pull over any vehicle that fell below 25 miles per hour to prevent bottlenecks. Colonel Charles Thrasher, reviewing the estimates, saw that they needed nearly 6,000 vehicles operating at 90% readiness. By any traditional standard, this was impossible. Yet, within a day and a half, the impossible became reality. On August 26th, Drivers of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC 2.5-ton trucks, the legendary Deuce and a Halfs loaded with artillery shells for Patton's army over 300 miles away. The makeup of these drivers would have stunned Nazi racial theorists. Of the 23,000 men who served on the Red Ball Express, about 3/4 were African American soldiers in a still segregated U.S. Army. Men who faced discrimination and segregation at home were now the lifeblood keeping the most celebrated American general moving forward. They were the key to victory. Within hours, the drivers forged their own culture. They gave their trucks nicknames and painted slogans on the sides. Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They developed their own road etiquette. The slower truck always pulled over, and any vehicle with serious mechanical trouble was simply shoved into a ditch to clear the way. By August 28th, bewildered German reconnaissance units began sending back reports of something they had never seen before. They described an unbroken stream of vehicles, headlights visible for miles at night, with no spacing and no attempt at concealment. They estimated 1,000 vehicles an hour. Their conclusion: the Americans had abandoned basic military caution. This observation contradicted everything in German field manuals. Lights at night invited air attack. Continuous columns offered perfect targets for artillery. Yet the Americans seemed completely unconcerned. Lieutenant General Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division watched the route from a concealed position and reported to his superiors, "The enemy runs a supply system we cannot comprehend. Vehicles pass at roughly half-minute intervals, day and night, without pause. They do not hide, they do not spread out, they do not follow any rules we recognize. This is not military science as we understand it. It is mass production turned into a weapon." What the German officers failed to grasp was that American logistics operated on a fundamentally different philosophy. Where German doctrine stressed concealment and careful procedure, the American strategy relied on sheer, overwhelming volume and constant improvisation. Where the Germans husbanded every vehicle, the Americans planned for a certain level of failure and simply powered through it with more trucks and more drivers. The numbers produced by the Red Ball Express shattered all German calculations. In its first week alone, it delivered almost 90,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself burned 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep the trucks running. In a stunning display of industrial might and human endurance, the Red Ball Express fueled. Patton's blitzkrieg liberated Paris and pushed the Allied armies to the very frontier of Germany, proving that in modern war logistics wasn't just part of the battle, it was the battle itself. When German logisticians later captured the American supply statistics, they initially dismissed them as inflated propaganda. But the numbers were real, and they were still climbing. By September 5, 1944, the Red Ball Express had found a rhythm that seemed impossible to officers who still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons. Convoys were leaving the western end of the route every 5 minutes. Each convoy averaged 67 vehicles, with a standard load of 5 tons per truck, though many carried up to 7. The 3-100-50-mile one-way trip took about 14 hours. At each end, the turnaround time for unloading and reloading was just 2 hours. At any given moment, about 5,000 trucks were in motion somewhere along that route. The Red Ball Express constantly birthed new solutions as drivers and mechanics, tackled problems that German manuals would have called insoluble. Around 1,800 vehicles broke down each day. Mobile maintenance crews fixed many right there on the roadside, applying a quick triage system. If a truck couldn't be fixed in 15 minutes, it was simply pushed off the road. Parts were stripped from vehicles deemed not worth saving. Engines were pulled and replaced in roughly 45 minutes with the help of mobile cranes. When the main route became clogged, drivers scouted and created their own alternate roads. They seized French buses to move personnel, freeing up trucks for cargo. They even pressed captured German vehicles into duty, repainting them olive drab and adding them to the convoys. When bridges had been destroyed, they pushed rubble from ruined buildings into rivers and gullies to build temporary crossings. German observers saw only chaos, but that apparent disorder produced results they couldn't even dream of matching. Their own military doctrine emphasized careful scheduling, planned maintenance, and strict process. The Americans ignored most of those rules, and somehow the system became even more efficient instead of collapsing. Fuel management, in particular, left German officers in awe. The Red Ball Express used roughly 300,000 gallons of gasoline each day just to keep its own trucks running. That was more than many entire German field armies received for all their needs combined. Yet miraculously, the American fuel never ran out. This was thanks to another engineering marvel working in parallel. Operation Pluto, or pipelines under the ocean. Fuel lines were laid right across the English Channel. By September 1944, gasoline was flowing through underwater pipes that German intelligence had completely failed to detect. Forward fuel depots were spaced about every 25 miles along the Red Ball route. Tanker trucks ran their own dedicated convoys, making sure no vehicle ever waited longer than about 10 minutes to refuel. Major General Walter Warlimont studied aerial photos of American supply areas and remarked bitterly that a single American fuel dump was larger than all of Germany's strategic reserves combined. The Americans, he noted, burned more fuel just moving fuel than German forces received in total for some of their panzer formations. This was no longer war in the European sense. It was industrial overflow. The Red Ball Express did more than just keep Patton's formations moving. It multiplied their speed far beyond anything German planners had assumed possible. German doctrine held that under ideal conditions, an armored division might manage 20 to 30 miles a day. Patton's divisions, fed by the Red Ball Express, were averaging 40 to 60 miles daily for weeks at a time. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armored Division advanced about 35 miles in the morning, paused at midday to refuel and rearm, and then pushed another 32 miles in the afternoon. That single day's gain of 67 miles completely shattered German expectations that no armored formation could sustain more than 30 miles in 24 hours. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, reviewing these reports in East Prussia, initially refused to believe them. No armored force, he insisted, could keep up such a pace for a week. Normal mechanical wear and tear would make it impossible. He assumed the Allied reports were either propaganda or that they were misidentifying smaller units. But intercepted American radio traffic soon confirmed the distances. What was even more disturbing to German officers was how casually the Americans handled their radio security. They often discussed positions over the air without encryption, completely convinced that they could maneuver faster than German forces could possibly react. By September 5th, German intelligence had assembled detailed studies of the Red Ball Express, and the consequences for German planning were disastrous. Every single one of their earlier assumptions about American capabilities had to be thrown out. Their report listed findings that contradicted the very foundations of German military science. American units discarded vehicles freely, leaving damaged trucks behind rather than dedicating scarce resources to full repairs. Drivers operated while taking stimulants, staying awake far longer than any German personnel regulations would ever allow. The Americans ignored camouflage discipline, making their entire network theoretically vulnerable to air attacks that, thanks to Allied air superiority, rarely came. They endured mechanical failure rates that would have crippled any European army, but they offset it with a massive redundancy in vehicles and parts. Their fuel consumption levels would have bankrupted any continental power, but they were treated as just another cost of doing business. Field Marshal Walter Model summed up the situation grimly. If the reports were accurate, he said, Germany was facing not only a strong army, but a stronger civilization. The Americans didn't bother to hide their supply system because they no longer feared German retaliation. They wasted resources because they could afford to. This model, concluded, could not be beaten by clever tactics alone. But the Red Ball Express drivers paid a heavy personal price that German officers couldn't see from their aerial photos. Some men drove for 72 hours straight, hallucinating from exhaustion and the drugs meant to keep them awake. Accidents killed around 300 drivers during the life of the operation. Trucks collided in thick fog, flipped on broken roads, or burst into flames when their overheated engines finally gave out. Even so, morale stayed incredibly high. Most of these drivers, the vast majority of whom were African American, knew they were part of something historic. Many understood that with every mile covered and every ton delivered, they were disproving Hitler's vile racial theories. Captured German officers later spoke candidly about what they had witnessed. General Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944, told his interrogators that German officers realized the war was lost once they truly grasped the American supply system. The Americans broke every rule, he said. They squandered fuel, abandoned trucks, and ran their drivers to the absolute limit. Yet they succeeded simply by overwhelming the problem with sheer numbers. They had, he admitted, industrialized war in a way that Germans could not possibly match. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. At night, Wehrmacht troops could hear the constant rumble of American trucks for hours on end. The sound of those engines became a constant, roaring reminder that the enemy had endless ammunition and fuel, while they themselves often had only a few rounds each. The noise of the convoys became a form of psychological warfare all on its own. The trucks themselves were a marvel to German engineers. The GMC 2.5-ton truck, the core vehicle of the Red Ball Express, was a product of American mass production on a scale Germany could not rival. By the end of the war, General Motors alone had built more than 500,000 of these trucks. That's more than the total number of trucks of every type combined in the entire German armed forces. These trucks came standard with features that Germans either lacked entirely or reserved only for their most elite units. All-wheel drive was common, not a rarity. Systems allowed tire pressure to be adjusted for different terrain. Electrical components were waterproofed, so trucks could ford water nearly 3 feet deep. The engines could even run on lower-grade fuel without any modification. Even small details, like cab heaters that actually worked in the winter, impressed German observers. American maintenance philosophy was just as different. Where German mechanics would painstakingly rebuild a broken engine, American units would often just swap it out entirely. Where German supply officers rationed every last part, Americans would scrap entire vehicles for relatively small faults. Where German doctrine relied on a few highly trained master mechanics, the Americans trained vast numbers of good general mechanics, able to perform most repairs rapidly. As the front lines rolled eastward, the Red Ball Express adapted with startling speed. When the original route toward Chartres became inadequate, the Americans spun up additional express systems almost overnight. The White Ball Express linked Rouen with Paris. The Green Diamond ran from Cherbourg to key rail transfer points. The Red Lion connected Bayeux to Brussels. A series of ABC routes linked Antwerp, Brussels, and Charleroi. Each new route went from a plan on paper to a fully operational system in about 2 days. German staffs would need weeks to organize far smaller systems. The Americans simply marked new routes, assigned trucks and drivers, and started hauling. The heavy involvement of African American truck companies in the Red Ball Express created a jarring contradiction for Nazi race ideology. Official doctrine labeled black people as inferior, incapable of technical responsibility or initiative. Yet these very same drivers were performing logistics feats that elite German units could not even dream of matching. The African American soldiers themselves recognized the profound irony. They knew exactly how Nazi propaganda described them, and this knowledge drove many to push themselves even harder. Every successful run wasn't just a delivery. It was a personal victory against a racist myth. Some German prisoners, forced to help load supplies, found their deeply ingrained beliefs shaken. They worked alongside black non-commissioned officers who calculated weight loads faster than their own engineers, spoke better English than many German teachers, and, to their surprise, treated them with a fairness they didn't expect. But the Red Ball Express wasn't just about the drivers. It demanded an infrastructure that German officers considered impossible to create under combat conditions. While the artery was pumping at full speed, American engineers built or strengthened around 40 bridges, set up 15 large fuel depots, opened 26 maintenance points, and created 8 temporary camps for the drivers. One bridge at Mantis had been deliberately blown by German engineers, a strategic move to choke American supply lines. Their staff estimated a replacement would take at least 6 weeks. American engineers erected a temporary crossing in about 14 hours, all while convoys detoured only 8 miles on quickly bulldozed bypass roads. German engineer officers watched the American construction with disbelief. There were no long planning conferences, no elaborate sets of drawings, just crews that arrived and immediately began the work. The Americans were building faster than German forces could demolish. New logistical structures seemed to appear overnight in French fields. One achievement, in particular, shocked German artillery officers. American ammunition supply levels surpassed their highest theoretical projections. U.S. artillery fired without the strict limits that had constrained German batteries since early 1942. During the reduction of the Metz fortifications in September 1944, 10th Corps' artillery fired around 100,000 shells in a single 24-hour period. The Red Ball Express delivered every single one of those rounds and still managed to build up a surplus. In stark contrast, the German artillery units defending Metz were restricted to about 50 rounds per gun each day. The gap was crushing. American batteries maintained almost continuous fire for hours. German officers calculated that such barrages required roughly 50 truckloads of ammunition per hour. The Red Ball Express made that a reality. The operation chewed through vehicles at rates that would have brought any other army to a grinding halt. By late September, the mechanical attrition was enormous. The average truck's life had fallen to about 10,000 miles instead of the normal 30,000. On any given day, around 30 out of every 100 vehicles were out of action, awaiting repair. Mechanics were installing about 500 replacement engines and using roughly 10,000 tires every single week. More than 5,000 trucks were wrecked or abandoned over the life of the Red Ball Express. Yet the operation never slowed. American industry had anticipated these heavy losses. Ships pulled into French ports with hundreds of new trucks each week. Replacement drivers were trained in a matter of days and sent out to join the convoys. German calculations showed that the Americans were destroying more trucks each week than the Wehrmacht had in all of France. Yet the total American transport capacity just kept growing. For French civilians living along the routes, this was a spectacle of abundance that contrasted sharply with years of German occupation. The psychological effect was immediate and powerful. Drivers, especially the African American troops, often ignored regulations and shared their rations. Children gathered at every stop, and drivers handed out chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. German reports noted with alarm that Americans were giving away items that their own authorities had rationed harshly. Intelligence officers observed that French civilians now saw an American victory as inevitable, pointing to the endless convoys as undeniable proof. Resistance activity rose dramatically along the Red Ball routes. Villages that had tolerated the occupation now showed open support for the Allied forces. In early September 1944, the Red Ball Express met its greatest test. Patton's Third Army had moved so far so fast that even this powerful supply system began to strain. Round-trip distances exceeded 700 miles. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. Vehicles wore out even faster than expected. German intelligence picked up on these signs of stress. General Hasso von Manteuffel reported on September 8 that American supply lines showed signs of unraveling. Convoy spacing had stretched from 5 minutes to 15. Average vehicle speed had dropped. He believed this was the moment to strike. Yet again, American flexibility confounded German expectations. Within 3 days, Red Ball planners completely reworked the system. They inserted intermediate transfer points so individual trucks drove only about 350 miles each way. They created formal driver rotations, set up forward repair depots, and doubled the number of vehicles assigned to the task. By September 12th, the daily tonnage delivered had actually increased. What should have been a fatal crisis instead made the system even stronger. In addition to the Red Ball Express, the Americans introduced another logistical method that the Germans had dismissed as impractical: large-scale airborne resupply. C-47 transport aircraft began flying critical cargo directly into forward areas, with each plane carrying about 3 tons. On September 16, 1944, German observers counted roughly 900 transport flights in a single day, moving about 2,700 tons by air. For perspective, at its absolute peak, the Luftwaffe had managed around 300 tons per day into besieged Stalingrad, and they considered that an extreme, unsustainable effort. The Americans treated their transports like flying trucks, rarely bothering with heavy fighter escorts, simply accepting the losses and counting on sheer numbers to win the day. This industrial arithmetic left the Wehrmacht without an answer. The Red Ball Express also operated under command practices that violated all German military habits. Junior officers made decisions that, in the Wehrmacht, would have required a general's signature. Sergeants coordinated operations larger than those normally controlled by German colonels. To German eyes, American logistics looked leaderless and chaotic. It seemed every lieutenant acted like a general, and every non-commissioned officer acted like a field-grade officer. German analysts expected chaos to erupt. But instead, they saw an effectiveness they could not hope to equal under their own rigid hierarchy. By October 1944, the restoration of forward railheads began to reduce the pressure on the Red Ball Express. A system originally intended to run for about 10 days had by then operated for 82 days, delivering more than 412,000 tons of supplies. German commanders, now fighting along their own borders, took stock of what they had witnessed. Field Marshal Model wrote in his final assessment that German forces had not been defeated primarily by American tanks or aircraft, but by American trucks. The Red Ball Express proved that in modern warfare, logistics was not a supporting arm, but the very core of strategy itself. The shift from the truck-based express routes back to normal rail-carried supply was itself an extraordinary feat. American railway units rebuilt roughly 1,000 miles of destroyed French rail lines while the Red Ball Express was still running at full tilt. They laid new track faster than German units had destroyed it, often using captured German locomotives and cars. The final statistics for the Red Ball Express stunned German prisoners when they saw them after the war. 82 days of continuous operation. More than 412,000 tons hauled. Over 120 million ton-miles covered. An average of nearly 6,000 trucks on the road at any given time, with peaks closer to 7,000. 23,000 drivers. About 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily. 40,000 tons of ammunition delivered to Patton alone. 15 million rations moved forward. 135,000 tons of medical supplies transported. Reviewing these figures in captivity, German officers admitted a fundamental miscalculation. They had based their estimates of American logistics on European standards. They had taken their own best performance, multiplied it by 3, and assumed that would approximate the American ceiling. In reality, they had underestimated by at least a factor of 10. Beyond tonnage and distance, the Red Ball Express delivered a deeper, more demoralizing wound to the German war machine. It shattered the German officer corps' belief in its own military superiority. Commanders who had once dismissed Americans as soft, spoiled, and overly reliant on machines now watched in disbelief as those same Americans performed one logistical miracle after another, fueled by sheer determination and overwhelming industrial power. In prisoner of war camps, captured German soldiers would sometimes just stand silently at the fences, counting the endless convoys of American trucks rumbling past. Some of them wept. They understood the grim reality. The question was no longer whether the Americans could supply their forces. The terrifying truth was that the Americans could lose more trucks in a single week than Germany could build in months, and still somehow grow stronger. Their entire understanding of warfare was collapsing, one truck at a time. But the Red Ball Express also forced the United States Army to look inward, confronting a painful contradiction. The operation's success depended heavily on African American soldiers, who were still serving in segregated units, denied equal status, and often barred from frontline combat. When General Eisenhower visited a Red Ball depot in September 1944, he saw this hypocrisy firsthand. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded the moment. The general watched black drivers, some of whom had been behind the wheel for 20 hours straight, and remarked that those men were winning the war just as surely as any infantrymen. He then added that many things would need to be reconsidered when the war was over. The undeniable success of the operation amplified the calls for change, becoming a major catalyst that helped lead to the desegregation of the American armed forces just a few years later. In the fields of France, African American soldiers had proven what they had always known. Given the tools and the opportunity, they could match anyone. The Red Ball Express was their battlefield, and on that battlefield, they had won a decisive victory. German racial theorists, who had built an ideology on hierarchies, had no answer for this. Their publications, which had previously pontificated on the supposed inferiority of other races, simply stopped mentioning American logistics. The facts were too powerful to explain and too damaging to their narrative to even acknowledge. After the war, German military engineers studied the Red Ball Express in obsessive detail. The lessons they learned reshaped logistics theory across the globe. They saw that sheer volume could compensate for a lack of perfect efficiency. They learned that having redundant equipment made the whole system less vulnerable. Decentralizing command increased speed and flexibility. Standardizing vehicles and parts multiplied capacity exponentially. And they discovered that human endurance, when properly motivated, could stretch far beyond what any peacetime regulation would ever assume. General Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in 1950 that the Red Ball Express had proven that logistics dictates strategy, not the other way around. The Americans, he admitted, understood this instinctively. Germany learned it when it was already far too late. Amidst the statistics of the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, countless personal acts of courage later emerged from official records. There was Corporal John L. Houston, who drove for nearly 48 hours without a real sleep break to deliver critical ammunition to the 2nd Armored Division. He nodded off at the wheel 3 times, only to be roused by other drivers and push onward. Then there was Private Booker T. Washington. While hauling medical supplies, his truck's overheated brakes caught fire. Regulations demanded he abandon the burning vehicle immediately. Instead, he kept driving for 2 more miles until he reached a field hospital, jumping out only when flames licked into the cab. The supplies he saved were used to treat wounded soldiers from both sides. Stories like these, repeated thousands of times, revealed a military culture that was alien to German observers. It was a culture that rewarded individual initiative, calculated risk-taking, and a relentless focus on completing the mission, even if it meant bending the rules. In a desperate attempt to copy what they saw, German planners tried to create their own version during the Battle of the Bulge. The plan, codenamed Operation Grief, involved using captured American trucks to create fast-moving German supply lines. The project was a spectacular failure. German drivers couldn't maintain the grueling American pace. Their mechanics struggled to service the unfamiliar vehicles. and their fuel stockpiles couldn't support the American trucks' thirst for gasoline. But the most fundamental difference was a cultural one. The Germans could not bring themselves to imitate the American willingness to simply write off equipment, to accept losses as the necessary price of speed and victory. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who was involved in the operation, reported that his men captured about 50 American trucks. Within a week, 30 were out of action. An American unit, he noted with a mix of awe and frustration, would have simply replaced them. His German units tried to repair every single one. That difference, he concluded, explained their defeat. The winter of 1944 brought the ultimate test. Freezing rain, snow, and ice should have paralyzed all wheeled transport. German military manuals were clear. Truck logistics became impossible once temperatures dropped below 10 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet the Red Ball Express kept moving. Drivers wrapped chains around their tires, poured alcohol into their cooling systems to prevent freezing, and simply continued to roll. Speeds dropped from 35 miles per hour to a crawl of 15, but the tonnage still got through. German intelligence reports described American convoys driving through blizzards that had completely halted their own panzer divisions. The Americans had created something unprecedented. A supply network that functioned regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy action. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't efficient in the precise German sense of the word. It was simply, terrifyingly, unstoppable. In May 1945, after Germany's surrender, captured German logistics officers were tasked with analyzing the records of the Red Ball Express for historical documentation. Their conclusions were unanimous, and a bitter pill for their national pride. General of Infantry Friedrich Schultz wrote that the Red Ball Express was a form of warfare they had never even imagined. The Americans, he said, had created a temporary, mobile civilization, thousands of men and trucks, and millions of tons of supplies devoted solely to feeding their armies. And then, once it was no longer needed, they just dismantled it. Germans had always built permanent infrastructure, a process that took many years. The Americans, they now realized, could build superior temporary systems in a matter of days. Perhaps the most penetrating post-war evaluation came from Heinz Guderian himself, the father of German Blitzkrieg doctrine. He admitted that while Germany had invented the Blitzkrieg, they had never solved its central, fatal flaw: supply. The Americans, he wrote, had solved it by deploying a level of industrial surplus that the Germans had always considered a fantasy. The Red Ball Express, he concluded, wasn't a supply line. It was a river of material that simply drowned the German forces. The financial cost of the Red Ball Express was around $100 million in 1944. For German staff officers, accustomed to thinking in terms of chronic shortages, this number was almost incomprehensible. But to American leaders, it was a bargain. The operation helped capture roughly 400,000 German soldiers, liberate France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and shorten the war in Europe by an estimated 6 months. Consider this: each day of global war cost the United States around $250 million. By that measure, if the Red Ball Express shortened the conflict by even a single day, it more than paid for itself. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, the commander of logistics in Europe, later stated bluntly, "We had worn out about 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to destroy the German army in France." He admitted that in any previous war, such losses would have been seen as catastrophic. But in an industrial war, they were just acceptable overhead. An unexpected and powerful legacy of the Red Ball Express emerged after the war. Thousands of former drivers returned to the United States armed with the unique experience of running the largest, most intense truck network the world had ever seen. Some of them went on to found their own trucking companies. Others worked on the design and implementation of the new interstate highway system. They were instrumental in creating the modern American freight industry. Companies that became household names like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were all heavily influenced by former Red Ball veterans who applied the hard-won lessons from France to peacetime commerce. They had learned that massive volume could outweigh perfect efficiency, that speed often mattered more than elegance, and that if you kept the trucks moving 24 hours a day, you could transform an entire economy. Today, military historians widely agree that the Red Ball Express was the single most decisive logistical operation of the European theater. Without it, Patton's Third Army would have ground to a halt. The liberation of Paris might have been delayed for months, giving German forces time to dig in and establish formidable winter defense lines. The operation validated a core American military doctrine, one that prized logistics as highly as battlefield tactics. While German officers studied the classic military theorists and brilliant maneuvers of history, American officers studied production lines in Detroit and railroad timetables out of Chicago. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate proof that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to supply your forces means more for ultimate victory than sheer tactical brilliance. On September 15, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the West, received a full intelligence report on the Red Ball Express. He spent hours reviewing it, absorbing the staggering numbers. Finally, he summoned his staff. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice grim, "we face a problem that is beyond a purely military solution. The Americans have built a supply system that cancels out distance. Our entire strategy was built around the moment when an advancing army outruns its supplies. That moment," he concluded, "no longer exists for them." Colonel Hans Speidel, the operations officer for German Field Marshal von Rundstedt, had an idea. He suggested they concentrate what was left of the Luftwaffe to attack the Red Ball routes. Von Rundstedt shot back, asking with what exactly they were supposed to do this. The Americans had about 6,000 trucks, he pointed out. Even if the Germans somehow managed to destroy 1,000 of them, which he highly doubted, the Americans would just replace them within a week. To make a real dent, German planes would need to destroy around 200 trucks every single day. The problem was, they no longer had 200 planes available at the entire front. But behind these cold, hard numbers were human stories. Stories that taught the Germans a thing or two about the American character. They heard about drivers who hadn't truly slept in 3 days but refused to rest because their loads had to get through. They heard about mechanics working in freezing rain, half frozen themselves, just to keep the convoys rolling. And they heard about young men who had lied about their age when they enlisted, just for the chance to get behind the wheel and drive. These stories started to spread like wildfire through the German ranks. They chipped away at the propaganda-fueled image of the soft American soldier and built up a new mythology of American endurance. These Americans weren't soft. They pushed themselves harder than German soldiers drove their horses, and they did it by choice, not under the threat of a whip. This realization made them far more dangerous than German military doctrine had ever assumed. The Red Ball Express also became a powerful, if unplanned, propaganda tool for the Allies. At night, German soldiers would lie in their foxholes, listening to the endless, grinding roar of engines in the distance. They imagined an infinite stream of supplies flowing to the front lines. Even in sectors where there were no convoys nearby, some German units reported hearing phantom truck noises. The belief that the Americans had limitless supplies while they were rationing their last shells and scraps of food absolutely crushed their will to fight. American psychological warfare units quickly noticed this effect and decided to lean into it. They started broadcasting recorded truck engine sounds toward the German lines, especially when no actual convoys were present. German troops, already on edge, reported these ghost convoys as if they were real. It was a chilling testament to how deep the psychological wound had become. By November of 1944, as more and more rail lines were repaired and brought back into service, the Red Ball Express was formally shut down. But its methods had forever changed the way modern armies thought about supply. This idea of constant, high-volume, almost wasteful-looking but incredibly effective logistics became a cornerstone of United States military doctrine. And there was one last innovation that marked the end of the operation, something that was just as impressive as its creation. This enormous system, 23,000 men, around 6,000 vehicles, hundreds of depots and camps, was completely dissolved in about 3 days. Troops were reassigned. Trucks were redistributed. The roads reverted to normal use. To put that in perspective, German operations of a much smaller scale had taken months to assemble and sometimes years to unwind. The Americans built what they needed for the moment, used it to its absolute limit, discarded it, and then moved on to build something even better. When German generals finally surrendered in May of 1945, many of them specifically mentioned the Red Ball Express by name. They saw it as one of the clearest signs that resistance had become utterly hopeless. The general of panzer troops, Hasso von Manteuffel, said during his interrogation that once they understood American logistics, they knew the war was lost. The Americans, he admitted, could supply their armies faster than German forces could possibly destroy them. The Red Ball Express, he concluded, was a weapon they had absolutely no way to counter. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, was asked what surprised him most about the American military. He didn't mention their tanks or their planes. He answered simply, "Your trucks." The Red Ball Express showed him that the United States had mobilized its entire industrial base for war. His soldiers, he realized, hadn't just been fighting American troops. They had been fighting American factories. The final numbers for the Red Ball Express tell a story that transcends any single battle. Over 412,000 tons of cargo delivered. More than 122 million ton-miles driven. Nearly 6,000 trucks in daily use, sometimes peaking around 7,000. 23,000 drivers. 82 days of relentless operation. About 57 million gallons of fuel burned. Around 180,000 tires worn out. More than 5,000 vehicles lost to breakdowns or enemy action. But on the other side of that ledger, about 47 German divisions beaten, in large part through sheer supply dominance. The war in Europe shortened by an estimated 180 days. These numbers mark the moment when modern warfare truly shifted. Industrial capacity began to outweigh tactical finesse. Logistics started to dictate strategy instead of just supporting it. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the Red Ball Express. The ceremony at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C., was a long overdue recognition for an operation often overshadowed by combat narratives, but one that was just as crucial to the Allied victory. Veterans who gathered there spoke with immense pride about their role, about proving that American industry and individual grit could overcome any obstacle. Many of them were black veterans who had faced segregation, discrimination, and had been largely ignored during the war. And yet, they had delivered victory at 35 miles per hour. The Red Ball Express showed that in modern war, logistics wasn't a secondary service. It was the central effort. The operation proved that a democratic, industrial society could marshal its resources on a scale that authoritarian efficiency simply couldn't match. German generals who had once openly mocked American logistical habits were silenced by the reality of it. Thousands of trucks delivering more than 12,000 tons of supplies a day across hundreds of miles of newly liberated territory. They had expected the Americans to follow traditional European norms to conserve material and advance cautiously. Instead, the Americans unleashed a flood of supply that completely overwhelmed the German forces. The success of the Red Ball Express didn't rest on traditional notions of military genius. It rested on traits that the Germans never fully understood or appreciated: a culture of mass production, a deep well of mechanical skill, a knack for improvisation, and above all, the incredible initiative of individual soldiers. These were soldiers who were empowered to make immediate decisions on the ground, decisions that, in the German Wehrmacht would have required approval from the highest ranks. In his memoirs, General George Patton paid the Red Ball Express what was perhaps the highest compliment. The truck drivers, he wrote, deserved as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat formation. They drove despite exhaustion, despite breakdowns, and despite weather that brought armored units to a grinding halt. Without them, he said, his Third Army would not move. And without movement, he wrote, we do not win. The story of the Red Ball Express ends with 23,000 mostly African American drivers, 6,000 trucks, and a one-way road to victory. They did what German science and doctrine had insisted could not be done. They kept the Allied armies in motion, moving faster than physics and military theory seemed to allow. They pushed human endurance to its absolute edge and proved that in an industrial war, the side with the most trucks often beats the side with the most refined tactics. German generals had laughed at American logistics. 82 days later, they were surrendering to armies that had been kept alive and advancing by that very same logistical machine. They finally understood that American trucks had beaten German tanks, and that supply had become strategy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most incredible logistical feats, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories you might have missed. See you in the next one.